As stated earlier in our chapter on the collision test, collisions are a very important part of any particle system, in that they allow our particles to interact with the rest of our scene. If you can imagine you have particle rocks falling off the back of a truck, this effect is not going to look very convincing if our particles tumble from the truck and fall straight through the road. Another function of collisions is to use them as a form of proximity test for various purposes. In particle flow, collisions are implemented as a partnership between a collision test or collision spawn test with our flow and a collision space warp in our scene. The test provides much of the fine control within the partnership and also allows us to pass on any collided particles to a new event via its wire. The space warp deals more with settings such as friction, the amount of bounce of the particles, and the randomness of that bounce when the collision actually takes place. I'll show you those elements here quickly in the viewport. Here we have our particle flow, and you can see we have a collision test here, and you can see in the pick box I've actually picked an S deflector, and that's actually shown here in the scene. Now the S in S deflector simply stands for spherical, so as you can see in this case it's actually spherical in shape. The system is very flexible in that a space warp may be used in multiple collision tests anywhere within our flow. Even better, any collision test can have multiple collision space warps assigned to it, and so you can have it handle the collisions of any number of scene objects. If you have multiple space warps in a scene, and you want each one of those to be tested in an event, the best approach is to actually put all of the space warps into one test wherever possible. Of course, if you need different test criteria for each space warp, then you will need to place each one within its own test to get that flexibility. So, before we have a look at the collision space warps themselves, let's have a look at the collision test and how it functions. In fact, in this chapter, what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at the collision test, and in the next chapter, we'll actually have a look at the space warps in more detail. Okay, so let's have a look at the actual collision test itself. The first option we have is a pick box, and this pick box, along with its associated add, buy list and remove buttons, allows us to add collision space warps to the operator. One of the great things about this list is that you can have multiple collision space warps in the operator, and they can be of any type, so you pretty much have total flexibility. In this case, I will actually pick the S deflector to add it, and I'll point our particle stream at the deflector. So if I actually remove that from here, the usual way you would actually add collisions to a scene would be, if I actually get rid of this completely, you would, let me just open the depot, I would go to collision test, place it in the event that I actually want to have the collision be tested within, drop it in. It needs a space warp in the scene. In this case we just have one, which is this S deflector here. So I'll go to add, and I'll just pick the S deflector, and you can see it's listed in this list here. Now if the particles collide, they won't actually leave this event, they'll stay in it. But they will actually collide with the deflector and bounce off, or whatever you have actually set here, to be honest. And if you want them to be passed on to a new event, you have to wire it up to a new event. Simple as that. Now, the actual criteria for that test are actually set up in this section here. Test true if particle whatever. And you can see that you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different options here. And each of these obviously makes our particles react to the deflector in different ways. Let's quickly run through the different options that we have here. You can see the default option is that the particles will collide, and you can see that within collide we have a flyout, and the default option for the flyout is speed bounce. So let's actually play our flow and see what happens. The particles are going to fly out of the source here, and they're going to fall downwards, or rather they're just going to travel downwards. There's no actual gravity or anything like that. They're just going to travel downwards, and if we're lucky, they should actually collide with our space warp. So let's see what happens. Press play, and there you go. They bounce off. As you can see, to make it much more obvious that they've actually collided, I pass them to another event, and in that event you can see that their color is set to red, and the geometry is actually displayed. You can see I've set it up as a tetra here, so it's very obvious that they've actually collided with a spherical deflector. I'll just stop that. The other options you have in the flyout here are bounce, which as I said is the standard, continue,